So today I wanted to talk about making interactive learning activities. And my talk is broadly going to focus on sort of why might you want to do these, where in the learning process might you wish to include them, and then we're going to get down into the nuts and bolts of exactly how you do it and what are some of the best practices for making interactive learning activities, and how can we design things that are truly effective for our students. So I want to begin just a little bit by sharing some of my background to try and inform what some of my remarks are going to be. So myself, as alluded, I have sort of a weird dual role in the math education space. I'm both a professor at the University of Victoria, which is in Western Canada, as well as a YouTuber in math education. And both of these are going to inform my use of interactive learning activities in very similar ways, despite seeming so different. So as a professor, I mainly am focused and mainly interested in the major calculus sequence from first to second year calculus. And I've been interested in this at a couple different universities now. I also teach some higher level courses like math modeling, but my main hat is calculus. And the reason why this is relevant is that in the courses that I often teach, I'm teaching very large courses, for example, 250 students in an enormous lecture theater. That's the context that I work with. A context that, for example, many of my students who are coming from high school, and I think when I looked at the registration list, a lot of you were high school students, they might come from a very different environment, and then they're going to the environment in which I teach, and that can cause a little bit of discord. On the other side, I started posting my videos for my courses on YouTube, and it kind of blew up a little bit. And so now I'm regularly posting videos on YouTube. And I like to contrast these two different mediums, these two different ways of teaching, being a professor in a big, large lecture theater versus being a YouTuber and posting math videos online. Okay, so let's dive in just a little bit to this. So what does it look like to be in my class? Okay, so this is a photo from Italy a long time ago, but I think that in fact that there's a few different similarities to today's class. So, okay, you have some sage on the stage at the front who's sort of lecturing away. You have a bunch of sort of keeners in the front row, but as you go back, as things start to fall apart a little bit, this person looks like they're sleeping. This person looks like they're very much not interested in what's going on. These people are talking. I think this person's playing on their smartphone. I don't know whether any of these jokes are going to work over the context of a Zoom thing, but nevertheless. So the point of this here is that while this is a university from a long time ago, in many ways things haven't changed. For example, this is myself. This is when I was a university student. This is what I looked like a little bit. And it's a lot of the same behavior. So sometimes I'm taking notes. Sometimes I might ask a question. Although when I was in first year university, that was intimidating and I didn't do that very much. But a lot of the time I'm sort of relaxing, playing on my devices, sleeping, talking, something like this. Okay, so that's a standard problem that happens in university courses. But okay, well, what about YouTube? So this is my YouTube channel. This is what it looks like. And what you'll notice is that you can come and basically take a course. You could take a course in discrete math or linear algebra or calculus 1, 2, 3, 4, and I have some more that you can't see. But the point is, you might just go here and watch all the videos in this discrete math course. So how is that similar and how is that different? You know, I'm very proud of my YouTube channel. I like it a lot. I'm very proud of my teaching in class. But both of them have a big problem. And I'm wondering if you can anticipate what the problem I'm going to say is. I'll focus in on one video to make the problem a little clearer. So this video is, if you search anything for like Bayes' theorem or intro to Bayes' theorem or something like this, my video will almost certainly come up. But there's something weird going on with the numbers here. Notice, okay, 750,000 views, 395 comments. So what's the tension? So when you watch a video on YouTube, or when you're a participant in a 250-person class, somehow 250 is such a large number that 250 versus 750,000, they're both just sufficiently large. It's many, many, many to one. It's just passive. It's one directional. It's me out to an audience. It's teacher-centric. And this is fine. People can learn in this way. People have learned in this way for a very long time. But there seems to be something missing when there's a lot of focus in education this way. When it's an instructor or a teacher sort of pontificating from their front of the classroom or from a YouTube channel. And so the point I wish to raise is the value of active learning and including active learning into your pedagogy. I use this metaphor of juggling, and I quite like this one. I use it for my students all the time because I think that mathematics is like juggling. I mean, you can watch a video about juggling. You can learn things about juggling patterns and techniques and forms, and the experts telling you about juggling is certainly going to help you become a juggler. But you have to juggle. You have to juggle a lot. You have to be actually going and actively engaged in juggling. And so I broadly speaking, think that we sometimes miss this, and that we want to include more active learning or active juggling. And many of you who are the high school teachers might be including this directly in your courses and in your pedagogy already. And that it's sort of us at the university level that have a higher impetus to sort of be thinking about this and moving in this direction. And there's indeed mounting empirical evidence and mounting calls to action among the mathematics community in higher education to incorporate more elements of active learning, whether it's flipped classrooms or many other different types of things. I also think that while active learning can have some sort of empirical claims, like it might increase the tendency to succeed, I also am really interested in the role in which having students engaged in the learning process affects things, for example, like growth mindsets or anxieties around mathematics. Indeed, when I tell somebody new, say, I'm a math professor, have you ever heard this? Have you ever said, if I say I'm a math professor, the response being, well, I'm bad at math? I'm told this all the time. I don't believe them, by the way. If you think that, I don't believe you. I think everybody can enjoy math and can learn at math and can improve at math, but that growth mindset is often a little bit missing. Likewise, people have a lot of anxieties. So if you believe you're bad at math, you try to shy away from it. You don't want to do it. So I think there's a big role here. It's not that it can solve all problems, but I think there's a big role here for active learning. So just to summarize some of those problems, I have often seen that there is going to be unfortunately high and unequally distributed what we call in the industry DFW rates, which stands for getting a D grade or an F grade or withdrawing from a class. So a student that might withdraw from first year calculus or fail it or get a D. Those rates can be stubbornly high, stubbornly low retention as you move. And so people who go into university forgetting what they learned in high school, people who take first year forgetting it for second year, these fixed mindsets about mathematics and anxiety about mathematics. I don't believe that active learning is necessarily able to solve all the world's problems, but it's an interesting one and a tool that we have. Okay, so I now want to try to think a little bit more about what active learning can be and give you some sort of paradigms to conceptualize that. So the first of these is I really think of active learning not as one thing, but as a spectrum. There's pedagogies that are more teacher-centered. So focusing on a presentation by a teacher. So right now we're doing a very teacher-centered workshop, and then there's going to be more student-centered, using the slight that I'll call you all students, but in this context. Or the point is it's a spectrum. And a student-centered pedagogy can be more interactive, it can be more collaborative, it can be more exploratory, and it really puts the onus on the students to do a lot of the learning. So it's not just one's better or worse, just that different types of environments and mediums and pedagogies lend themselves more to one or the other. So this is just one of the paradigms you can think of. Next, you can think, well, where should the active learning go in the learning process? And there's different ways to think about this. So you could think about, well, should it go before class? Should it be during class? Should it be active after class? It could be any of these. I've done versions of active learning that have had active learning in all of these different components. But you can try to think about where would it be best in your context. Another one is, should active learning be done individually or collaboratively? One of the really big benefits of active learning is that it allows for more collaborative work. And collaborative work is what a lot of mathematics really does. And as you continue on as as you sort of go on into industry or into academia, I mean, when you do mathematics, it often is collaborative. And so being able to learn mathematics collaboratively can be very powerful. It doesn't have to be that way, but it can be very powerful. And a thing that we face a lot now, given our pandemic, is could it be in person or could it be online? So indeed, at my university, we've spent a year now, more, teaching online. And I was actually fortunate or unfortunate, I'm not sure, to do online teaching even before the pandemic as well. So you can think, should your experiences with active learning be in person or should they be online? Now, I just want to just share a few places that I personally have used these. And so I began my journey into teaching very much with traditional sort of style where you establish a foundational knowledge and then you work on problems. But I've these days moved a lot more in my in-person classes to what I call flipped learning, which is the same thing, foundational knowledge and then work on problems. Did I make a typo? Not really. People think of these as different, but it's basically a question of where they're different. So in a traditional university class, you're taught by the professor during the class, and then you do homework, which is where all the active learning happens after class. In a flipped classroom, maybe you're taught some foundational knowledge in videos before the lecture. And then it's during class where you're working on activities where you can really use, for example, Maple Learn to have students dive in and do things. It's not that you can't do active learning in traditional learning. You absolutely can. You can have a wonderful class with lots of activities developing foundational knowledge, but there's sort of a time shift. And then it's actually a more radical change, but when you do problem-based learning, perhaps it flips around where you're starting with problems, you're being motivated by problems, and you build out of that the foundational knowledge. It inverts the order of these things. So this is sort of different approaches that I've taken in person, but online, I have a specific approach that I take. So I know some of you may or may not be teaching online right now, but so I thought I would share a typical daily module, what that looks like for me in my online courses these days. There's many different things that have a little description that tries to motivate and to excite and to sort of catch the attention, kind of be a bit clickbaity, if you will. Learning objectives, you're gonna hear about learning objectives later. I always think it's important to tell students what it is that they're supposed to learn. This is the objective of today's class. I then like to have a bit of a preview question that has people thinking about what's going on before they even learn some content. I teach the content, quote unquote, in the video, where it explains the core pedagogy. These are now posted to YouTube. And then this is the big spot where for me in my online modules, active learning occurs in post-video activities. These can be many different things. It can be a problem you work out just by pen and pencil. This could be a Maple Learn activity where you go through and do stuff. It can be many different things, but the point is to practice and to solidify and to deepen and to extend the knowledge that you learn inside of the video. And then finally, I'm a big fan of formative assessment, something like a quiz or just a quick thing that says, did you understand what was being taught? Have you made progress? And can you demonstrate that to yourself and to me and get feedback on that? Usually I do formative assessments, not in a particular tech tool like Maple Learn. This would be in a learning management system. Maybe you get 1 point for it or something like this. So this is just some ways that I've been incorporating active learning myself. So now I want to really think about, and I should add that I really, for me personally, and different people may differ, for me, it's in that preview question and the post-video activities that I really am most likely to use a tool like Maple Learn, which we're going to talk about at the end of this sort of little workshop. Okay, so I've shared a little bit just of an introduction to why I really like active learning and some ways that it can be used, but now I really want to focus on how to design an activity. And I want to begin by thinking about backwards design. This is one of the most important and powerful shifts that I've had in my thinking about how I design activities. So this is what I used to do. It's very one directional. I would say, okay, I have a class today. I need to think about what I'm going to lecture on. I'm going to lecture on this topic in calculus, and I would go and write down my notes for what I wanted to talk about. I then think, is there any activities that I could add in to augment what I was just talking about? I then go and make the homework. And then after the homeworks are out, then I might make a test. Finally, I might make a final exam. It's sort of starting from the what am I going to teach and then going forward through the activities, forward through the assessments. What I would suggest instead is a backwards design. A backwards design works a little bit like this. It begins with the learning objectives. I think learning objectives are really important. I mentioned I include them directly in my pedagogy and my signaling to students, but learning objectives are mostly useful for me. If I am very clear about what I am trying to get students to learn in this particular course, I start with those and then I work backwards. And I think, well, hold on, how am I going to assess those learning objectives? What does the final exam question look like? What would be a weekly quiz or a homework look like that was building up to the final exam after doing that, sort of going from bigger stakes down to lower stakes? I then think, well, what activities would have students being actively engaged in the things that they're going to do for their assessments? See how I'm working backwards? When I'm thinking about my activities, I'm leading them to the assessments, which lead to the learning objectives. And then finally, I think, what kind of lecturing should I do? If I'm going to make a video or if I'm going to talk in front of the class for a little bit, I want to do things that support the activities that will be done in class, that will lead to the assessments, that will satisfy the learning objectives. And this backwards design thinking, I think, just really changes the perspective. And it specifically is going to help your activities be more front and center than sort of ancillary. Like you do your teaching and then if there's some time you do an activity. No, you want to think about what your activities are and then you support the activities with your lectures. The next thing I want to think about, another sort of dichotomy that we have here, not a dichotomy, excuse me, a spectrum, is an activity can be very specific, very concrete, like solve this particular thing, take this derivative, factor this quadratic, where there's just a thing you have to do. And on the far end of it can be very open exploration. You can be asking students to go out and try to learn something new with very little prompting, and it can be, they can spend a lot of time and freedom on it. And then somewhere in the middle, I sometimes call this one guided discovery. So guided discovery is a lot about sort of extending what you have and thinking about the material in new ways. So there's scaffolds there, there's supports there that are guiding the journey, but it's not just do this one thing, do this next thing. Now, again, none of these are better or worse than the other. They just have different roles at different times in the learning process and depending on what the context is. I mean, I love concrete problems. It makes it sound like I think this is a bad thing, but I really like how you can solidify your knowledge and you can deepen your knowledge and you can take your knowledge and put it into your long-term retention. So I do think that there's plenty of value in focusing on concrete problems. Indeed, to be able to get to something with sort of open-ended questions where students are exploring and playing around and using some of those higher level features that Maple Learn is able to get to, which we'll talk about, they often have to have a really strong foundational base. And so including these sort of concrete problems is good. And open exploration problems can be intimidating, have a lot of anxiety. Having some guides, some process there can be helpful. So I just want this spectrum to be clear. So when you think about I'm making an active learning activity, okay, well, what type of one might you be thinking about? The next spectrum is difficulty. Difficulty is a very challenging one, particularly when you have a very diverse group of students that you're working with. When an activity is too hard, then one of the experiences that you can have is that it's frustration, that the anxieties about mathematics, the fixed attitudes towards mathematics can inhibit it because of the difficulty of it. When it's too easy, it can be perceived as pointless, busy work, this hurdle that the professor is just telling you to do that you don't really want to do. Now, this spectrum is maybe too simplistic because one of the things I like to do is to add a lot of scaffolds and supports into it. Maple Learn is particularly good for this because it allows you to do things like, for instance, take the computational aspects that might be tedious, or someone might make a quick typo and say, no, I didn't make a little algebra mistake because I verified my algebra with something like Maple Learn. And now I'm able to go on and go forward. So if you make a mistake, and that's where the difficulty comes from, you have that sort of support there. But I like breaking complex things into smaller scaffolds so that anybody in your classroom is able to start working and start developing on whatever the activity is. And likewise, I really like having challenges and extensions. I like having sort of a core learning objectives I'm trying to get, but ways that students can improve and to go on to sort of harder and more challenging and more sophisticated and deeper ideas as well. So when you're thinking about difficulty, you're not just sort of nailing one spot. You're thinking, I want to build support so that everyone's able to sort of be involved in this, but that everyone else really can go on and go further than my original intended learning objective was. You've very likely have seen Bloom's taxonomy before, but this is Bloom's taxonomy, and it talks about a way to sort of scaffold. I mean, the difficulty, as I say, is way too simplistic. So this is perhaps a much more sophisticated version. But it notes how low down in the taxonomy, you have basic skills like remembering facts and understanding facts. Or at the top of the taxonomy, you have very high level skills like evaluating the efficacy of a model or creating your own model and things of this nature. So when you're trying to think about your learning activity that you're building, you want to think, well, hold on, where in this learning process, where on this pyramid, where on Bloom's taxonomy, am I trying to fit my learning activity into? And so again, it's not one's better or worse than the other. It's very important to build up foundational knowledge. Something as simple as remembering, I'm going to talk about later, is quite important. We might eventually want to go to the top. I mean, these are sort of the sexy things. Oh, you're creating and you're evaluating. I mean, that's often where you would like to get students to. But it's okay to spend a lot of time building the foundations down at the bottom. That's absolutely all right. But your activity should reflect what your learning objective is. And this is why I think it's important to be very concrete about what is your learning objective for this activity. Where does it land on these different type of spectrums? Is it high up on Bloom's taxonomy? Is it very open? Is it very concrete? Is it going to be very challenging? And if so, what kind of supports do you have? So a few different things to think about when you're designing activities. So the first is, I really like having authentic problems. Now, an authentic problem is not the same thing as an application or an applied problem. It could be. Like, it's great if you're teaching a specific type of mathematics and you teach it in the context of something that's very applied. Later on, I'm going to show an example from financial math. And financial math, as you can imagine, has lots of very applied problems and are sort of intrinsically motivating because people, want to be good with their money or, want to be a millionaire or something like this. How do you get there? But authentic problems can be in pure mathematics. They can just be ones that are not just there for sort of busy work. They're just exciting. The questions lead to interesting things. You're almost inspired to want to know what the answer is. So the more you can add authenticity to your activities, the more likely students are going to pick up on it. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. There's a lot of studies around this. So when you're intrinsically motivated, so interested in it for its own sake, you tend to learn it better. If you're extrinsically motivated, like I'm doing this to get a grade, it's a pretty bad motivation. But even like I'm doing this thing that I don't like and I don't want to do because it will help me when I'm computer programming, or will help me in my physics, and that's the thing I'm interested in. That's also a little bit an extrinsic goal. So the more you can sort of build this authenticity and intrinsic interest into it, the better. And sometimes that interest is done by having really compelling applications that people want to do, but sometimes it's not. The next thing I like to think about is the difference between procedural fluency and conceptual understanding. And there's a relationship between these. So we often, I believe, fall too far in the direction of building procedural fluency, which is a good thing. Like if you have some function, some quadratic, you need to factor it. How fluent are you at executing that procedure? Higher level learning and math skills often is built out of these foundations, and procedural fluency is important. Nevertheless, I think it is a good idea to have a broad conceptual understanding and to develop in students understanding of the mathematics that they're actually doing. And so when you're using a tool to design an activity, you should always filter what you've done through this. Because sometimes tools lend themselves more to being excellent at procedural fluency and not into building a conceptual understanding. And I want you to always say, well, hold on, am I at the right spot on that spectrum? Have I built in a true understanding of this? And then the final thing I'm going to put on this particular slide is something that I've been doing a lot in my own teaching, which is building stories and narrative arcs. Math is sometimes perceived as a bunch of facts with and statements. This happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. This is true, and this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and. You even just change it a little bit and use buts and therefores, very basic storytelling technique. this happened, but then this other thing happened. And therefore, we have this resolution where you have a tension and a resolution. You have an interesting question, a building. If you can add those storytelling elements into your activities, start simple, has an interesting question. Things don't go quite the way you expect, so you have to resolve them, and you get that kind of narrative-based activity builds a lot more intrinsic interest into it. So when I tell stories on YouTube, which is sometimes what I like to think of. I mean, I think I said I'm a math professor making math videos on YouTube. No, I'm a storyteller. I'm telling math stories. You can do the same thing with your activities. Okay. I now want to just note a few things that come out of the science of learning, some techniques that have been shown to really improve people's learning in the long run. So the first of these is something called spaced retrieval practice. So spaced retrieval practice is the following idea. If I tell you a fact, you're going to learn it and you're start forgetting it very quickly. I then need to tell you with some space, get you to retrieve that fact again to be able to remember it. And again and again. Basically, the curve is that the more you have these retrievals, the longer the spacing until the next retrieval has to be. So a pedagogy that involves a lot of spaced retrieval practice is very effective. And indeed, when you're building an activity, I often like to build in little reminders of previous stuff from weeks and months past and build those into the design of your activities as well. So you have that spaced retrieval right there. Similar, there's a concept called interleaving. Interleaving is where you take different concepts and you mix them together. And that tension, that difficulty that comes from having to try and have different types of concepts in different types of areas being put together and mashed together, that's challenging. That increases the challenge of your activity, but it's highly effective. So this is great for incorporating with spaced retrieval practice because you're trying to bring back old facts into your new facts. You're interleaving them together. You can even tell them in a story to get those narrative elements in. You do it with authenticity. Sometimes hard to design these. You can make them sound wonderful. It's easy to say, but it's harder to do is I guess what I'm trying to say here. A third thing that's really interesting is about predictions. If you ask a student to make a prediction, you remember in my online modules, I had sort of a preview question that I would often do that was related to this fact. You have your students make predictions. Well, then this nature of sort of getting invested in it actually helps their long-term retention because they want to know what the answer is. And so having predictions built into your design of your worksheet can be extremely effective. Then the final thing that I'm going to refer to coming from the science of learning is about the concept of cognitive load. This is like the amount of mental stress on the student's brain when they're having to learn. And a mental stress comes in different ways. Sometimes they talk about like intrinsic load, which is like the start that's just intrinsic to the problem that you're doing. There's a certain amount of work you have to do when you factor a quadratic. I'm going to keep on using that example every time. There's a certain amount of work that you have to do that even someone who's been doing it a long time has to do. But there's also an extrinsic load, which is about the medium in which you are being taught. It's way easier to draw a square to someone who doesn't know what a square is than it is to describe it with some words and writing. It would be challenging, right? So a lot of times you want to focus on reducing the ways in which the medium is inhibiting their learning because it has a lot of extrinsic load to it. There's actually a lot of power of some software tools like MapleLearn where the sort of parts that add a lot of intrinsic load that you say if you're doing it just by paper and pencil, things like going through a sort of boring and mundane calculation that's obscuring the broader conceptual understanding. Things like that have a lot of extrinsic load and can be really removed by these learning tools. I'm going to very briefly talk about creativity, which is a high-level learning. It was at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. And this is something where you really need some freedom to explore, to be able to develop your creativity, where you want to feel like you're in an environment where it's safe to make mistakes and to go back from it, where you can build up from your foundational skills. Creativity at the top often is thought of as its own thing, but it's really built up from the bottom from all the sort of foundational skills that come through. And finally, if you're going to be doing something with a lot of creativity, you really want tools that build for their flexibility. Okay, so that's my first little introduction here. And what I'm going to do next is switch over, and I want to show you a little bit of Maple Learn. And let's just move things around here. All right. So I have a relationship with Maple, and I make videos, and I put them on YouTube, and I try to incorporate Maple Learn into those videos. And one of the ones I did is a fun one, just about algebra mistakes. I even got a bit of a clickbaity title here. But what you can see is that while I am in this specific video, I'm actually in the background have Maple Learn that I'm sort of manipulating and playing around with. And we can go and open what this is. So, okay. All right. And so this is an algebra-based one. And I was talking in the video and explaining some ideas in the video of sort of common algebraic mistakes that students make, and different types of errors related to cancellation is one of them, different types of errors related to sloppy fractions, as I often call it, very different types of fraction errors is another, and you can really play around with these types of things. And one of the things that you can do if you're in Maple Learn is if I type some expression, I can, and I've shown what to do, which is to click simplify the expression, and it just goes and evaluates it for you. Now, why do I like such a thing? First of all, my passive video, right, where I began with this, right, when I'm just sitting here and I'm just talking through it, I'm telling students things. And that's great, but they don't have the opportunity to do anything active. So now they have the opportunity to do something active, but they can do it in what I call a self-regulated way. They can try this in a safe environment, without pressure, without points. And if they can understand what's going on here and get the right answer, that's great. But because they're allowed to click any of these things and come along and click the simplification button, that by doing this, now they're able to see, well, did they do it correctly or did they not? And if they made a mistake, they can go back and they can learn from it. So this worksheet is very much based on building up foundational skills. We're just talking about sort of cancellation and so forth. I also am personally, this is I'm showing you these because they're connected to the medium that I do. If I'm doing a flipped classroom where I might have a worksheet that lasts for the entire class, most of the pedagogy is put into the worksheet. Here, in this context, most of the pedagogy is in the video, just because that's the what's being informed by the medium. And then it's down here that you play around with that document. You get some extra practice to extend what you learn, to deepen what you learn, and so forth. The next one I want to show you, this I like this one a lot. This is one I thought was quite interesting. This was one about financial math that I did recently. And so it's the same type of thing. I go through sort of the principles myself. This is an example of me talking about it and going through the development of the formulas, but I also spend this time working through a Maple Learn. And so if we come over here, here's the Maple Learn document, and I want to show you a few features of it. All right. So in this document, I have 3 different calculators. I have a simple interest calculator. I have a compound interest calculator. And I have a continuously compounded interest calculator. And there's a few things that I like about it. So number one, I like that it's scaffolded. In the video, as I introduce the concept, we start with simple interest because it is simplest and students can build from there. They're understanding, they understand simple interest quite well. Compounded interest is more challenging, and continuously compounded interest can seem very, very foreign. So it is scaffolded in that sort of easy to challenging spectrum. This is one that starts easier and builds up. Next. Well, I really like that when I'm teaching financial math, one of the goals that I have, one of my learning objectives is not just formulas, is not just memorizing that the formula for compound interest is P times 1 plus R over N to the T. It doesn't matter, people will forget this. What I want them to build up is a little bit of an intuitive sense to the numbers. I want them to have some sensation that they're building up a money sense, a number sense, an understanding. And so, for example, if I click down here, you'll see what happens. I get 2 different things. So first of all, I get a nice visual plot that shows, well, if I started here at $10,000 with 20% interest, compounding once per year, these are explained in the video. They're not explained in this worksheet. Then I get this kind of behavior, or I can get it numerically as a chart. I start with 10,000, then I make 12,000, 1440, ends up with, after 5 years, 24,000. The video, I add authenticity to this. I can say, well, imagine you were to have a credit card debt of $10,000. And imagine that your credit card had a 20% interest rate and you just were like, I'm not going to pay it off. What would that look like in 5 years? And now you're like, okay, I owe $25,000. That starts to be a little bit scary. And it should be scary. So there's an ability to ground this type of worksheet in something that has a little bit of authenticity to it. So I quite enjoy this. And I really like most that I get to play with these. Okay, 20% is really high. Now, if imagine I'm investing, I get to take my sliders and I get to wiggle them around. So you can say, okay, I want to imagine that I'm now investing this. And I'm gonna say I'm going to invest it in the markets and I'm going to look at historical averages. And I'm going to say that I can make 7%. Maybe I'll try to compound this. That grew up quickly. Let's make it 12 times. So, once a month. Now I can say, okay, my $10,000, if I invest it now at this amount, I can get here. But notice what I'm doing. I'm playing around with these numbers. And I'm like, okay, well, hold on. What if instead I was changing this amount? Okay, well, like what would the effect be if I double this and made it 20,000? 14 to 28, it completely doubles, which makes sense because there's P over here as just sort of a linear factor out the front. Anyways, the point is you can decide what questions you want to ask of your students. Now, here's my favorite part. And this is actually coming up in a future video that's going to use Maple Learn, although no one in MapleSoft knows this yet. This is you're finding out. What I want to do next is to ask the students to extend this. So here I built the calculators, which means the learning objective is a lot lower down. But the next problem is, well, what happens if you do, for example, $100 a month and you put that aside? Can you come up with the formula? Can we play around in class? And then here's the best part. Can you develop it in Maple Learn? And yes, students can do this. So I made these calculators in just a few minutes. And right now they're just calculators. So the value of the pedagogy is entirely outside of Maple Learn. If I wished, I could have come along here and I could have, typed in some instructions and asked my questions here. I wasn't doing that. I was doing the video. But not only can I ask questions, I can allow it to be truly creative, truly open-ended, where they are coming up with the calculators entirely on their own. So just a few closing things about why I specifically like Maple Learn. I enjoy its flexibility. I enjoy that you can ask many, many different types of problems, and you're flexible to add as much text and commentary in the software as you wish or not. So in my examples that I was showing, most of my commentary was in the videos, and so the activities were very sort of like supporting those videos. But if you want, you could go nuts and you could put your entire pedagogy entirely within the documents. It's up to you. Now it's going to sound counterintuitive. So any tech tool like this, it excels most at computation. That's the best part of these things. So you might think that's really only good for computational things, kind of like my Cancellipalooza and algebra mistakes I was doing earlier. But I think that's not the case. I think by taking away the computation, by allowing that to be quickly verified and checked and perhaps even done, that this means that you are now open to focus more on the conceptual understanding, those higher level learning objectives. So indeed, that's partly what I have valued it for, is you can go to these higher level learning objectives, like make me a calculator that deals with the fact that you're putting $100 a month into your bank account and trying to figure out what the long-term value is going to be from that. I really like the sort of the sliders and the ability where you can build some intuition for how the inputs affect the outputs. And finally, I really like that it is a sort of self-regulated learning, that you can assign a student to work on this and they can just go and they can learn at their own pace and they can be corrected and they can be supported and come back to you or supported by the software. There's a lot of options, but allows them to regulate their own learning and to really take it into their own hands. The final slide I wanted to show you is a slide from the National Association of Colleges and Employers, and it talks about the top 10 skills that they want undergraduate STEM majors to have. So as a university professor, I think about this type of thing a lot. And you can read through the whole list, but a few things I want to stand out. So first of all, I noticed that, let me go back to my highlighter or laser pointer, there we go. Notice that in yellow, there's a lot about working together. So interactive learning activities where you have this actually in the classroom and people are working together to build that calculator in Maple Learn, like to build the finance calculator, whatever it is. This I think can be very effective for just the learning, but also for the large sort of soft skills we're trying to develop. Of course, in red, I mean, this is why we teach math: solving problems, process information, ability to analyze data. All of these skills they want are really important to learning math. And if anyone ever wonders, well, why should you learn some sort of quantitative literacy skills? Why should you learn some math? Well, this is what employers want to see. And then, of course, proficiency with computer software programs. So there's always a question when you're trying to think about a tech tool to design an activity, the degree to which you're doing this specifically to aid the learning of the thing you're doing, or is it to help develop some of these broader skills? And I think that Maple Learn has an opportunity to, how to put it, it's not a programming language. It's an easy way for students to come in and to see how computer software can aid in mathematics. And I think it really has an opportunity to hit now multiple of these different points. All right, so I think I will end there. So I will just say thank you. If you want to follow any of my socials, you feel free to do that. And I'm here for the next 15 minutes or so. So I really love for you to think about what questions you might have, or either specific to Maple Learn or just broader about pedagogy. And I'm more than happy to answer any of those. So thank you for having me, and let's hear some of your questions.
Thank you, Trev, for that. I actually have a question, if you don't mind. Could you let us know, your first impression on Maple Learn? How did you find it as a professor? Is it easy to start with, create content? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if I'm going to be, biased, I suppose, in that I've been using tech tools for a while now. So I guess this is what I'm not 100% sure is true for everybody. For myself, I found it very easy to pick up and to learn. But then I've been using some of the sort of more higher power, like Maple's main product, for example. So a lot of it talks down. I do think, though, it is pretty easy. If you don't know how to do something, so for example, I didn't know about the sliders that I was using in Maple Learn, but there's a lot of it, really nice examples. And I think that spending a few minutes to go through the examples is actually really useful, because you sort of get a sense of what's already built out there. And so I would absolutely encourage, or that was my sense, at least. Did that answer your question?
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Trevor.
I was going to jump in here with, which is integration into the LMS. So for me, what I have typically done is just external links. So I'm in my LMS and I link out to whatever's going on. But the way I found the nicest way to do it is to either one of two things: type an authentic question that you want people to do, and then the question, when you click on it, links out, or screen capture the image. For example, if it's like a graph or something like that, screen capture the image, and then the image links out. So I think I maybe briefly mentioned it earlier. So when I actually do an assessment, so like a formative assessment where I'm, evaluating the student performance, I do that within my LMS. I've used Moodles and Canvas and Blackboard and a bunch of different ones by now. But the sort of practice phase is where I've put it into Maple Learn. So I don't know, you can sort of just play around with where you want to do it.
I have another question. Just wanted to ask, did you find the transition easy from Maple to Maple Learn? And do you find the complementary useful for really exploring concept and this type of things?
I mean, Maple Learn is much easier, in my opinion, to learn than the full suite of Maple. But it has the flip side of also being less powerful. I mean, it depends on what you're trying to say exactly, because I mean, I don't know how you all conceive of it, but the way I think of it is that Maple Learn is really focused on a pedagogical tool, not like a full service general mathematics suite. Now, I don't mean to talk that as a way to talk down to Maple Learn, because I think it actually does a lot of things. Most of the standard things that you think about in algebra and calculus and linear algebra, it can differential equations, it can do the standard things that you think it should do in all those different domains. But it's not trying to be, I don't think, a replacement to Maple. It's thought of as a better way to have students involved in it.
Maybe a last question for today, Trevor. So someone is asking if you could describe your process for coming up with engaging active learning topics.
So I spoke a little bit earlier in the beginning about my sort of backwards design, like learning objectives to assessment to activities down to lecture. And so when I'm choosing a topic that is going to be an active learning activity, using MapleLearn or even just in a classroom without MapleLearn, when I try to choose it, I am focusing primarily on things that I think are both important, but challenging. And another factor is that they have a high degree of friction. So an example of this is where graphing is a classic one. If you don't have a tool that allows you to do graphing, a lot of the things where you're learning about graphs and manipulating graphs and interpreting graphs just have a lot of friction that comes from the way you're having to describe them and write them down. They're static, they fix. You're not tweaking a parameter and seeing how the graph changes. So I try to find things where there's these friction points in the medium on important and difficult topics. And those are what I do first. I mean, now I do quite a lot of active learning. So you can't really throw a topic at me. I don't try to answer it by doing something active learning based. But when I was beginning, that was sort of how I tried to do it.